Okay, thank you for the lecture. And I would like to push all the questions to the end of the session. So let me introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is Professor Chang-Tai Hsieh. Chang-Tai is the Phyllis and Erwin Winkelried Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. And like Professor Lau, he's also a Berkeley PhD, obtained in 1998. Chang-Tai is also a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research and a senior fellow at the Bureau of Research in Economic Analysis of Development. Also, along with Robin, Chang-Tai is a co-director of the Microeconomic Growth Network at the World Bank. And Chang-Tai's research is mainly in growth and development, and he has published a bunch of papers in top journals. I think one paper that made him really famous is the paper at QJE, Misallocation and Manufacturing TFP in China and India, published in 2009. Chang-Tai was elected academician of Academian Sinica 2 years ago, to 2012. So this lecture by him doubles as part of the symposium for newly elected academicians for this year. So let's welcome Professor Hsieh.
All right, thanks. I must say that can you hear me? So I must say prior to this event, I must say I think I've only met Larry once. That must have been about 15 years ago when I went through Stanford looking for a job. But still, when Ping asked me a year or so ago whether I would give this talk in this talk in honor of Larry, there was only one answer I could give, which was absolutely yes, with incredible enthusiasm, because, you know, although I don't know Professor Lau personally, you know, his work and his career has been such an example for so many of us, particularly those of us who are Chinese and Taiwanese economists, not only for his academic contributions, but also for his numerous contributions to public life on both sides of the straits over the last, the last 20, 30, 40 years, I guess. 40. So there was so much to talk about that I struggled a bit when thinking about what I was going to talk about, and I was thinking about what Larry has made contributions to, and he's basically made two big contributions. That he's made seminal contributions in production theory, and he's made seminal contributions in helping us understand the economic revolution that has occurred here. Here in this part of the world. I thought that if I talked about production theory, I would put everybody to sleep. So I thought instead that I would talk about Asia. I'll talk about Asia, and then I would talk in particularly about, let me just call it the mystery of what's been happening in China, because I think this is something near and dear to Larry's heart that I know that he's thought lots about, and it's something I want to know what he thinks about it as well, and I think that he's going to give us his view. So what I'm going to talk about is based on joint work with Chong and Bai from Tsinghua, and then from Michael Song. So let me start by in the following way. So just think about the typical narrative that we have about about the economic revolution that has taken place in China since the early 1980s. And I would say that there's one that if there's any rough consensus, so I would say, so this is the rough consensus in the lunchroom at the University of Chicago, which is that it's a combination of the removal of shackles on the market and the removal of shackles on individual enterprise. It's a shift from Maoist ideology, to what I'm just going to call pragmatism, and then there's the opening to the world, opening to the world in all respects of the world. Okay, so what I want to say is that I think that this I think is the right narrative to think about the first 10 years of China's economic revolution. So I think this is the right narrative to think about what has happened in China, from 1979 to about 1989. But what has happened in China since 1989? So June 1989, we know what happened in June 1989, and there was a dramatic change. There was a dramatic change. Now China continued to grow very quickly afterwards, but I think that what has happened since then, so the kind of institutions that developed in China, what exactly has been at the foundation of the kind of growth that we have seen in China, I think is very different from the typical narrative that one has. So what we want to do here is to try to lay out a story for how to think about China post-1989. Okay, so the way that I will want to, perhaps sort of one way to start with the narrative is to pick up on a narrative in this recent book by Dadona Samoglu and Jim Robinson. So this is a book that that you might have seen in bookstores in airports on why nations fail, and it's a book that has it's a pretty remarkable book. It's a really ambitious book, and it's a book in which they have one story, one explanation that explains every single episode in human history since the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, which, if you think about it, that's pretty ambitious. That's really ambitious. So they go through the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. They say the same story can help you understand the rise and fall of Venice, the decline of the Mayans, the decline of the Aztecs, the rise of Western Europe, and they get to China. And they have a particular narrative about China. And the story that they tell about China is that what we've seen in China in the last 20 years is the kind of thing that we've seen in the last 2,000 years in societies that eventually fail. Okay? And they tell the following story. So they tell the story of this one entrepreneur and this one case, which is actually a pretty well-known case in China. So it's a story about this guy called Mr. Dai, who was a private entrepreneur, and he operated a small steel plant in the city about 200 miles up the river from Shanghai. And he wanted to start one of these large, humongous steel plants called Jiangsu Tianmen Iron and Steel. So he proceeded in the typical way. So this was the early 2000s, right? And this was the period where the only firms that were allowed to produce steel above a certain scale was a small number of state-owned steel plants. So as a private entrepreneur, you were not allowed to produce steel. But and this is going to be the narrative of what comes out of China, that this was a period in time in Chinese history where everybody was breaking the rules. And that's what this guy was trying that's what this guy was trying to do. So he thought, to hell with the rules, I want to get rich. Everybody else is getting rich. And my way to get rich is that I'm going to start off a large steel plant. So he went to the local boss of the Chinese Communist Party in that small city. He got the support of the local party boss. He got a loan of 10 billion yen. I suspect it's not from, anyway, I think his loan was from the Bank of China. He started to build in 2003. But by March of 2004, hell rained down on this project by the Chinese central government. The Chinese central government sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of inspectors to look through the books of this company, and obviously there were thousands of irregularities. I mean, every firm has thousands of irregularities. So this company was shut down. The local local party secretary that supported the project was fired, and this poor guy, Mr. Dai, was thrown in jail. Was thrown in jail, and then so why did this happen? Well, we don't quite know. Acemoglu and Robinson tell the story that the reason that this project came to an end was because this project threatened the profits of this other state-owned firm called the Bao Steel, which is the largest steel manufacturer in China. I don't think that's a quite narrative of what happened. I think that it was really a story about concerns about overcapacity, combined with the fact that Premier Wen thought that his manlyhood was being threatened by this project. But regardless of the reason why, right, what this episode illustrates is the fact that once the political authorities made a decision to kill your project, to throw you into, and to kill your project, take away your money, and throw you in jail, which Chinese Supreme Court could he appeal to? And this is the essence of what Acemoglu and Robinson are saying, that what this case highlights is the fundamental absence of the basic institutional foundations of a market economy. Okay? And then they go further and say this is exactly the kind of thing that you see in the fall of the Roman Empire and the fall of Venice, and all these empires that grew for a period of time and that eventually went into the decline. So what we want to try to figure out is exactly this puzzle, to try to understand what's been happening. So let me just first start by just giving you just a quantitative measure of what Acemoglu and Robinson are saying. So one way of doing this is to look at, say, they say the doing business indicators that are put out by the World Bank, and this is probably the most influential thing that the World Bank has done in the last 15 or so years. So if you look at, say, where China ranks in this, if you look at the overall ease of doing business in China, which is just a summary, which is just a weighted average of all the different things that goes into the business environment, China ranks 91st in the world. There are 185 countries ranked. So 91 puts China in roughly the same ranking as Guatemala and Zambia. Right, so we're not. So if you go to China, people talk about it's going to be 5 more years before China overtakes the U.S. It's going to be 5 more years before China overtakes the Zambians. And if you look at the different indicators, a different sub-indicator in terms of the ease of starting a business, it's 151. It's ranks 151 in a row, which is right at the same level as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In terms of getting construction permits, it's 181. There are 185 countries in the world, right? So it's hard to get lower. In terms of getting access to power, it's 114. Getting access to credit, it's 70. Protection of investors, it's 100. paying taxes 122. So all of this paints to a picture of a pretty awful business environment. So the question to ask is what exactly is somebody like, say, the chairman of Foxconn talking about when he's saying that the business environment in China is wonderful, and it's something that people, other countries should try to try to emulate. So the story and of course, if this is all there is to the story of China, if this is all there is to the story of China, then it's very hard to square the story with the kind of outcomes that we've seen coming out of China in the last 20 years. It's very hard to square that with, say, the experience that Mr. Goh has had, or the experience that 40,000 other Taiwanese in the Taiwanese firms that have gone into China, the kind of experiences that they have had. So the story that we're going to put that we put forth is that what exactly is the story for China in the last 20 years. So I want to be clear that we're talking about the model post 1989. Okay? And the model, we're going to call that model crony capitalism with a twist. And when the twist, I'll say exactly what the twist is. So I'll just say it's crony capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So think about it in two parts. The first part is, so the first way to think about it is that capitalism, or the institutional environment for business, is what we're going to call crony capitalism. It's something that is well known and it's practiced throughout the world. So very simply, what is crony capitalism? It's a combination of two things. The first thing is that it's a combination of bad formal institutions. The combination of firms can't get access to resources that they need, or you have an institutional environment where firms can't get access to the resources that they need, and you have rules that make no sense. Okay? That's what I call that. That's what we're going to call bad formal institutions. And then what is crony capitalism? Well, the way to think about crony capitalism is that even in places where formal institutions are really, really bad, okay, it is not the case that it is really, really bad for everybody. There's always going to be a subset of people, let me call them cronies, that have the ability that have the ability to massage the system. They have a small number of people for which life is actually really good. For life is really good. So basically, what are cronies? Cronies are people that have the ability to break rules that other people have to follow. Okay, so the World Bank doing business indicators applies to you, but they don't apply to me if I'm a crony. Okay, so that's well known. So this is what you see everywhere in the world where formal institutions are bad. Okay, and cronies are ones that get access to resources that other firms don't have access to. So nobody has access to credit except me because I have a special connection. So the first is that this is a fundamental building block of the system that has emerged in China in the last 20 years. And the first part of this is that, well, this sounds pretty awful. This sounds exactly what you see in the Congo. This sounds exactly what you see everywhere else. So then why are we talking about, why is the world talking about China? Why they're not talking about the Congo? The only people who talk about Congo are people like Angelina Jolie, who goes to Congo to look for her next kid to adopt. So why is China different? It's crony capitalism, but it's basically, let me just call it, it's crony capitalism pushed to the absolute extreme. So what are the Chinese characteristics that have emerged in the last 20 years that explains why crony capitalism as practiced in China has has resulted in outcomes that are very different from what we see in terms of what crony capitalism has produced everywhere else in the world. And there are going to be three things that we are going to say is important. Number one, we're going to say that the first thing is going to be that there's very strong local state capacity, and it's a combination. So here I'm talking about the kind of power and the kind of organizational structure that party secretaries and the party organization at the level of basically at the level of township, and it's not so much a level of township, at the level of counties and the one level up from that, prefectures. They have the ability to give you the permission to break rules, and they give you the the permission to break rules. Everybody down the bureaucratic food chain follows. So there isn't any of the petty corruption that you see in most other places in the world. They have the ability to provide you with resources. They have to provide you with resources. So one very important resource is the power to expropriate land, and that's happened on a massive scale. Every single local government, they have the power to give you access to capital. They basically lean on the local officials of the state, of the state-owned banks. And the first thing and the last thing is that there's also very strong provision of public goods as well. So that's the first part. Now you can ask the question: well, why do they do this? Why is it that they choose to do this? And this brings us to the second part of what we argue has been central in explaining what we've seen in China. And let me just call it delicately, since the late 1980s, the early 2000s, there has emerged a remarkable tolerance of corruption. And so what has happened, and I'll illustrate this case, but if you think about what happens as a consequence of that, is that there's developed a very clear mechanism that if you are an entrepreneur, and you want to start a large firm, there's a very clear mechanism that you use to get your business off the ground. You go find, it depends on the size of the firm that you're on. If you're a very large firm, if you're somebody like Mr. Go, you go talk to the local party boss. You make a deal with the local party boss, and this deal can take a variety of forms, from an implicit agreement to pay for his kid's tuition if he wants to go to Harvard. So that's like the lowest form. That's like the lowest form, to all the way up to direct equity stakes for members of the family. And I'll illustrate a firm in which that is that was the actual contract, though. But if you think about what that does, one way to think about what this is that the model is basically pushing the Coase theorem of politics to its logical extreme. You have a bunch of guys, the local party bosses of the Chinese Communist Party, that have all the power, and you are the entrepreneur. You know how to build a product, but you don't have the permits, you don't have the capital, you don't have the land. So, and one way to think about the remarkable tolerance of corruption is that it's basically the lifting of all the barriers to efficiency and enhancing trades. Now, you can think about all kinds of problems that would come about for that. But what has happened as the consequence of these two things is that in most places where crony capitalism is practiced, only a small set of firms are cronies, and you only see cronies in a limited type. In a limited number of sectors. So the typical cronies you're going to find are going to be firms that are in the natural resource sector, or firms that are in the service sector. Firms where but that is there in China as well, but what has happened in the last 20 years is that there's been an expansion because of the combination of these two things, because of the high-powered incentives by the local party officials. If you get rich, if Mr. Go gets rich, the party boss gets rich too. Okay, and the second thing is that these party bosses, they have the power, they have the political power, and they have the organizational capacity to deliver. And then the third thing which we're going to say is also important in thinking about the outcomes that we've seen in China is that it's not just a case that there's only one of these guys, but there are many of these guys. And that's going to be important in explaining some of the outcomes some of the outcomes that we are going to see, or we're going to see in the data. So let me just spend my time just giving you one particular case that illustrates how this works. How this works, and then we can talk about that. And then I won't talk about I'll spare you the model. I'll spare you the other types of evidence. But then we can think about what does this tell us about what is going to happen in the future, and what are the constraints that the system is going to reach. Okay. So the case that I want to talk to you about is the case of the car industry in China. And I want to talk to you first to talk about one company. Okay? And the first company I want to talk to you about is the Shanghai GM. This is the largest car manufacturer in China. It is 50% owned by General Motors of the US and 50% owned by this Chinese company called SAIC Motor Corporation. Okay? The SAIC Motor Corporation is like a typical modern Chinese state-owned firm, in the sense that it's a publicly listed firm. But the majority stake is held by this holding company called the SAIC Group. And the SAIC Group is owned by the local government of the city of Shanghai. So it's a local government-owned firm. It's not a centrally government-owned firm, which is going to be important when we go to the details of what happened next. This company also owns 50% of Shanghai Volkswagen, which is the second largest car in China. So if any of you have ever wondered why, when you go to Shanghai, the only taxis that you see are the Volkswagen Passats, this is the reason why. Right? And if you go to Beijing, you're not going to find this car. Right? So the only taxis you find in Beijing are what? Come on. It's a Hyundai. It's a Hyundai. Now, once you understand the structure, now you can take a guess on who owns that company. And then the other company that they own, the SIC, they also try to sell cars under their own brand. So it's basically this large locally owned firm that operates three firms: Shanghai GM, Shanghai Volkswagen, and SIC. So let me describe to you what Shanghai GM tried to do. Okay, so what it tried to do in the beginning when the company was set up, and then what happened afterwards. So the way that I would say it, okay, so obviously this is not what they would say, but my interpretation of what Shanghai GM was doing in the beginning. So this company was set up in 2001, and what they were trying to do was that they were trying to exploit their political connection with the local party, of the city of Shanghai, to sell the worst possible cars they could possibly sell at the highest possible prices. So this is what they were trying to do at the beginning. It didn't quite work, but why it didn't work is important. So let me show you what they were doing. The first car that Shanghai GM sold in China was this car called a Buick New Century. So I have a picture of the car. Okay, so this was the best-selling car in China. It had gone out by the time that GM introduced it in the U.S. It had gone out of production in the U.S. and they were selling it in Shanghai for about $45,000 $45,000. Now you could say that maybe the family in Shanghai, they have this love affair with the Buick, and they really love cars that only 80-year-old grandmothers would buy. Maybe that's a story, but I don't think that's it. I think maybe there's something to the fact that consumers in Shanghai in 2001 had no choice. No, they had no choice. That they would simply, and when you talk to the guys at GM, what they were very clear on is that the circle that they were trying to square was that, one, they wanted to make money, as every firm, they want to make money. And normally, when you want to make money, you try to make money by selling your best products. Now, the problem that they faced in China is that they knew full well who their partner was, which is the city of Shanghai, the party or organization in the city of Shanghai, and they were terrified that their intellectual property was going to be stolen from them by their partner. And they were fully aware that the only reason their partner wanted them there was to learn how to make cars. So their response, so roughly the way that they would say is that their response is that, okay, the way that we're going to solve this problem is that we're going to make cars, and then we're going to make cars, and then if you learn how to make cars from us, these are cars that nobody in their sane mind anywhere else in the world would ever buy. So this was the first car, was the Buick New Century. The second car, so they needed a car that was slightly cheaper, and they looked for the second worst car that they could find, and they found this car in their bankrupt German subsidiary called Opel. They took that car, they brought the design to China, and they sold it as a Spark, as the Chevrolet Spark. So I have a picture. So the picture in the snow, that's a picture of the GM car in Germany. By the looks of it, that looks like east versus west Germany, and then the other picture is that same car that's the same car in China. Okay, so the third car, so you can see what so then the third car they introduced to China, they needed a car that was slightly cheaper. That was slightly cheaper, so they wanted a small car. So they did the same thing again. They looked around their inventory of cars. They looked, for where can I buy? What design do I have that of a car can I find? So this time they found it in their bankrupt South Korean subsidiary. So they took the design from their South Korean car, the Daewoo, and they were going to do the same thing, basically bring that design to China, rebrand it as a GM car, and sell it in China. This is when their strategy started to fall apart. What happened? Okay, so they had built their plant to make the Chevrolet Spark. They were ramping up the production line. But 6 months before they were ready to sell in the Chinese market, another Chinese company had come onto the market selling exactly the same car. Exactly the same car. This is a company called Chery. Okay? And it was starting to sell the same car, so I found a picture of the two cars. Okay? As a picture, I guess these are Beijing license plates. So the car in orange, that's the GM car. The car on the right, that's the car made by this other Chinese company. So the guys on the GM in China, they tell a story about how they were shocked when this was happening. They were really worried that their intellectual property was going to be stolen by their partner. It turned out that it was stolen by somebody else. So they went and they bought this other Chinese car. They took the car apart and they realized the parts were interchangeable. These guys have worked from exactly the same blueprints. So what is this company? I find this is a fascinating company, and I think it's companies like this that have been central to what we've seen coming out of China, in the last 20 years. So this was a company that is founded in the city of Wuhu in Anhui province. So this is it's a kind of place where I think it's one of the most unlikely places you would ever see a car industry develop. It's a relatively poor place. At the time, it was far away from everything. There were no suppliers there. But you can see why this might sort of make sense, because it might be the case that economically, the most sensible place for a new car company to set up would be the city of Shanghai or the city of Beijing. That's where the customers are, that's where the banks were, that's where all the suppliers were. But once you understand the political economy, once you understand the institutions, right, there's no way on hell that this car company is ever going to have a chance if it sets up in the city of Shanghai. Because why? Because because exactly the person, the organization that it's going to need the support of, if it actually gets established, it's going to compete away the profits of compete away the profits. So there's no way that that a new firm is ever going to get the kind of support that they need from the party or organization of the city of Shanghai. So they started in the city of Wuhu where there was no car industry, and the local party organization, they were incredibly hungry for something. So it was started in 1996 by this guy who learned how to make cars from this joint venture from first AutoWorks and Volkswagen, and the party secretary of Wuhu. And this is the way that the guy who became the chief executive of this new company described the deal that he had with the local party secretary. So this is what he says the party secretary told him. You let me take care of the politics, the money, and the land, okay? You just focus on getting some cars built here. So it almost seems like, and there's a very clear road that in the same way that, if you wanted to start Facebook and you were in the San Francisco area, you drive down Sand Hill Road and you find a venture capitalist to support you. Now, there's no such thing in the city of Wuhu. The equivalent of the venture capitalist and also much more, the political fixer, the guy who's going to expropriate the farmers for you, is the local part, is this guy who's the local party boss. And there's this fascinating story of how they went about this, because they did not have the license to make cars. Because they did not have, because the license to make cars was only restricted to a certain number of firms. So the way they got started was that they first applied for permission to make cars. The answer came back, no. There's no way in hell that you're going to be allowed to make cars. So they went back, and what they got instead was a license to make car engines. So car engines, that's sort of fine. So they got the license to make car engines. So they went to the UK. They bought up an old Ford engine plant, and they took it to China. They started to make engines. Once they started to make engines, they went back to the Chinese central government, to the NDRC, and they said, we have a problem. We have 30,000 workers in my firm. If you don't let me put these engines into cars, these people are not going to have jobs. You've got to let me make some cars. What about the following deal? You let me make some cars, and I promise I only sell the cars in Wuhu. And so the NDRC said, okay, only in the city of Wuhu. You promise you won't sell in Shanghai or in Guangzhou or anything else? Yes. Well, that's what we promised. So they got that second limited license. So they made cars. They made cars. The first car they made was a clone of the Volkswagen Jetta. But you can see what's going to happen next. This is a poor city. poor city. There may be like 5 families that can afford to buy cars. Not 5, but I'm exaggerating. But they did their normal thing. They forced all the taxi drivers to buy the cars. That brings it up to 5,005. But there's no way that you're ever going to make money doing that. So then what they did is that then the party boss of Wuhu, he went to his political patron in the central government, and his political patron hit upon the following strategy. And the strategy that they hit upon is, why don't we go to SAIC, that company in Shanghai, and force them to take a 20% equity stake in our firm? Okay? So that's what they did. So the political patron of this guy that went to SAIC and they forced SAIC to take a 20% share of the equity stake in the firm. And what the guys at SAIC would say is that they did it kicking and screaming, but the political forces were too strong. So now that SAIC owns 20% of Cherry, they went back to the NDRC and okay, all right, just give me one more minute and I'll be done. They went back to the NDRC. Look, SAIC has a right to make cars. We are SAIC too. We are SAIC too, so we should have all the rights that SAIC has. So that apparently proved decisive. So that's what gave them the full license to make cars. And if you look at the Cherry, is fascinating because it's actually legally registered as a state-owned firm. Okay, it's legal, but if you look at the behavior of the firm, so let me give you one piece of data. Cherry is now the largest exporter of cars coming out of China. Okay, Shanghai GM is the largest manufacturer in China, but it exports nothing. Okay, and Shanghai GM is registered as a foreign firm. Okay, so it's a private foreign firm. Cherry is a state-owned firm. But really, if you look at the behavior of these two types of firm, which one is private and which one is public, it seems to be exactly so. So let me just take 30 seconds and just say, so I think this is the story that this has been at the source of, I think, what we've been seeing in China, and I think it's a huge improvement over what China was like in 1990 or in 1990. That it's not been through an improvement of formal institutions, but it's the development of these informal mechanisms to deal with the lack of formal institutions of that. Why is this a problem? First, you will see this now. One reason why there's a problem is the issue of equity. It's an issue of distribution. It's not viewed as being morally correct that local party bosses get rich from their control over public resources. And in the last year or so, there's been a pretty serious crackdown. And if our story is right, this crackdown is going to make China go back to what it was in 1990. If you sort of take our story literally, the second implication is that because you have this system now, there are going to be very strong vested interests against making formal institutions better. Because if formal institutions are better, then you don't need the local party boss. Then if you don't need the local party boss, then these are going to be the ones that are going to be precisely going to be fighting to try to stop the improvement of any of the formal institutions. And third, the broad question is, does future growth depend on better formal institutions, or can you push this crony capitalism models practiced in China further? Give me 10 more seconds. If you indulge me, I'll give you 10 more. Let me just give you a postscript to the story. Okay? Remember our old friend Mr. Dai, the guy who wanted to start a steel company, who spent 5 years in jail? Well, he got out of jail and he's had a comeback. He's had a comeback. So in 2011, he started a company that makes nickel alloy, using the same model. He went to another local party boss, got the support of another local party boss, and now the guy is his company is the largest nickel alloy producing company in China. So, thanks.
I think everybody's hungry. I am too. But let me hold you up for one more minute. And I would like to invite Professor Lau to speak a few words for us.
Let me see, how do I get the slide? Get the slide. How do I get my slides on? Let's see. This one? Double click. Okay, and the do you know how to get this to the slide? How can you do that? Well, first of all, let me thank Professor Khan for scheduling the session. I also like to thank Robin and Chang-Tai. It's a really great honor for you to give these wonderful papers. I just thought you might be interested in what I'm doing, what I've been doing in terms of research. I also want to correct one thing. I'm not the chairman of China Investment Corporation. I'm going to be the chairman, non-executive chairman of a subsidiary, small subsidiary of CIC in Hong Kong. Okay. So anyway. Don't blame me for anything. Now, I actually want to just give you the idea that China, since 1978, has always been the surplus economy. What do I mean by a surplus economy? That really means that the output of the GDP is really not supply constrained. It's really demand constrained. I think that's a very important idea. The first thing you notice is that in 1978, I think everyone would agree that in 1978, China operated very much inside in the interior production possibilities. So all you need is really demand and the right market institutions and so that's actually what happened. And Chang-Tai gave a very good talk about what happened, basically characterization of what happened, say, before 1989. But I want to move in the second phase. The second phase actually is really when the initial, this movement to the frontier has been more or less exhausted. Okay, what is coming on the second phase? The second phase really ties into what Robin is saying, that it's really the surplus comes from surplus labor and surplus capital, and also from economies of scale. Okay, that really needs to, you have production costs coming down everywhere, and that actually provides the backdrop for basically, again, what I call a surplus economy. The third part is really more recent. I would date it somewhere around 2000, okay, between 2000, 2003, thereabouts. It's really the development of excess capacity. You see, what Chang-Tai has told you is a microeconomic version of why there is excess capacity everywhere. Because every party secretary or every county can, in principle, sponsor automobile plants, student a steel plant, student a cement plant, and prevent other people from selling in that county. I mean, I think that's really what is happening. And as a result, there is tremendous excess capacity in China. Okay, we read about all the time in almost everything: steel, cement, glass, solar panels, you name it, and pretty soon automobiles as well. Okay, so that is really the backdrop. Now, let me show you one thing. China has very, very huge savings. The savings rate has been above 40% over the last 5-10 years. Okay, and it's very, very high. Now, it's always been a puzzle why, with so much savings, why is it there is still chronic excess demand for credit? People still want to invest. Everybody wants to invest. And in order to invest, they would want to borrow. Now, this is actually a slide. This shows you the distribution of Chinese GDP between service sector on the top. The blue is the manufacturing sector, and then the bottom green is the agricultural sector. You can see that it's, agriculture is really shrinking. But if you look at employment, okay, it's still a very, very large part of total employment in China. It's about 40%. This is really what Robin's talking about. I mean, surplus labor is still very, very important. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about chronic excess demand for credit. You always wonder, for the economy with 40%, 45% savings rate, why is it that still people say there's not enough capital? There's a shortage of capital. Why is there chronic demand? Now, the important idea here is the following, is that people who borrow, who succeed, basically do not plan to repay when things turn sour. Okay, I mean, that's a very important idea because that is really when you get chronically excess demand for credit. What I've shown you up on here, on the next slide, is really the interest rate spread between the renminbi and the US dollar. Okay, renminbi is on top, US dollar is on bottom. We all know, roughly speaking, from interest rate parity theory, that if you look at this chart, you will say that the renminbi is going to devalue. Okay, it's going to devalue. Now, it's true that China has capital control, but it's very leaky capital control. We all know that, all right? So why is it that the interest rate are like this? I mean, in principle, if the renminbi being an appreciating currency, really ought to have an even lower interest rate than the US, but it doesn't, okay? And that is a puzzle. And this shows you what would be this at the bottom, the green line down there is really the amount of appreciation of devaluation. So the renminbi relative to the dollar. I mean, it should be the other direction, but it's on the other. And I think the answer really comes from the fact that precisely because there's excess demand for credit in China, chronic excess demand credit, interest rate is very high. What you have here is the interbank Shanghai interbank borrow rate, interbank rate is overnight money. Why should it be so expensive? Okay, everywhere in the world is very cheap. In fact, if you actually look at the shadow banking, look at interest rate today, people are actually paying close to 20%, 15 to 20%. There's no way they can make that kind of money, in the expected value sense. So you have to assume that some of these borrowers don't intend to repay. That's why they can't afford. If you don't intend to repay. Now there is another piece of corroborative evidence, and that is for many years, the People's Bank of China, the central bank, they do not use interest rate as a deterrent. Right? They use rationing, credit ration. That's because they know that the borrowers don't care. Okay, you raise the interest rate by 1%, 2%. It makes no difference. It actually makes no difference. You don't intend to repay, right? So it's not a deterrent. So I think that is a very important thing to realize. Now, the other thing that is happening is actually, we actually didn't really coordinate, but I'm very happy that Chang-Tai talked about crony capitalism, because what is really happening is that the local government officials, since the early 2000s, they suddenly discover, one, is that land is money. Since they control the use of land, they have access to resources, and with land, they could do all sorts of things, okay? And this was not true prior to 2003. Okay, this actually happened after that. They could really do a lot of things. And I think if you really look at the wealth that has grown in China over the last 10 years, it comes from two sources. One is land, developers coming from land. The other source is mining, okay? A lot of coal and other mineral millionaires really coming from control of land. So that is very important. But I think the upshot of all this is that China today has excess capacity everywhere, okay? And that comes back to my point, is that the output in China is demand constrained, okay? It's aggregate demand constrained. And therefore, I am actually reasonably optimistic that China can continue to grow at least for the next few years at 7.5% with no difficulty, because it's really a matter of generating the demand. Where can the demand come from? The demand will not come from exports. All right? It will not come from exports. Export growth would be relatively slow, but I think it will come from infrastructural investment. Okay, it will come from controlling the environment, environmental control, restoration, preservation. It would come from public goods consumption, like education, healthcare, and so forth. So I think that the demand side is okay. Now I do share Chang-Tai's worry that this crony capitalism cannot be sustainable. Okay, and I think we have seen beginning last year or the year before last that President Xi Jinping is really trying to do something about this. Okay, and I think that the many localities are now really shaping up a little bit. But I think the important thing is really you need to change the key performance indicators for these party officials because before they were rated on GDP growth, they were rated on employment generated, right? Now you have to put other indicators in there, such as viability, long-term sustainability, how clean is the air, and so forth. So you really need to have a massive change in the key performance indicators. I think it would take a little while. I hope that will come. Thank you very much.
Thank you for holding you up. And I don't think we have time for questions. So the last announcement that I would like to make is that the lunch will be prepared and served in the 4th floor. Thank you very much.